I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it, and I read it to her in there, and I did sort of feel a sort of
innocence about her. You just thought, wow, this girl is...
There are moments in history when a single act of defiance reshapes everything that comes after it. When a quiet man in a centuries-old English estate picks up the phone, or perhaps more devastatingly, puts it down, and in doing so, rewrites the future of one of the most talked-about couples on the planet. This is one of those moments. Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, brother to the most beloved princess who ever lived, has broken his silence. And when he did, he didn't whisper. He detonated 4 words. That's all it took. 4 words that are currently bouncing off the walls of Netflix boardrooms, rippling through the manicured lawns of Montecito, and landing like a sledgehammer on the carefully constructed empire of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Is this a joke? Those 4 words are doing more damage to the Sussex brand right now than any royal courtier, any tabloid editor, or any palace press statement ever could. Because they didn't come from an enemy. They didn't come from a rival. They came from the one man on earth who has the moral authority, the bloodline credibility, and the iron will to say what the rest of the world has been thinking for years. And here's the question that every royal watcher, every Hollywood executive, and every Sussex supporter needs to sit with right now. When Diana's own brother looks at how her memory is being used and calls it a joke, at what point does the rest of the world follow his lead? We are going to break this story wide open today. We are going to pull back every curtain, examine every angle, and follow every thread of this extraordinary confrontation to its logical and deeply troubling conclusion. Because what Charles Spencer has just done is far bigger than one rejected Netflix proposal. He has changed the entire game. And Prince Harry, caught in the middle of a battle between his wife's ambitions and his mother's memory, may never recover from the shockwave. Stay with us. This story is extraordinary. To understand why this moment carries the weight it does, you first have to understand the man who delivered the blow, not the headline version, not the ceremonial earl who appears at commemorations and gives carefully worded statements, the real Charles Spencer. He is 62 years old. He has spent the better part of 3 decades living with a burden that very few people on earth could comprehend. He is the man who stood at the pulpit of Westminster Abbey in September 1997 in front of a grieving nation, in front of the royal family who had, in his view, failed his sister, and he delivered a eulogy that stopped the world cold. He didn't console. He challenged. He looked directly at the institution that had crushed Diana and promised, on record, before 2 billion watching people, that her blood family would ensure her sons were raised with the soul and sensitivity she cherished. Not with cold institutional rigidity, with soul, with sensitivity, with truth. That speech wasn't just a farewell, it was a declaration of intent, and Charles Spencer has been living up to it, quietly, strategically, and with absolute conviction ever since. Althorpe House, the Spencer ancestral estate in Northamptonshire, is where Diana grew up. It is where she learned to ride horses through English fields, where she played, dreamed, and became the person the world would come to love. And it is where she now rests, not in a royal vault, not in a public mausoleum, on a private island surrounded by trees she loved, on land that has belonged to the Spencer family for 500 years. 500 years! Charles Spencer is not just a grieving brother with an estate. He is the gatekeeper of the most significant legacy in modern British history. He decides who gets access to that island. He decides who gets to tell the story of the woman buried there. He decides what is a tribute and what is exploitation. And for years, he has watched, waited, and said very little. But something has shifted. Something has changed in the last few years that has pushed this famously private man to the point where he is now willing to publicly call out the most famous couple in the world. What pushed him to this breaking point? And why now? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning of what critics have been calling, with increasing urgency, the Diana cosplay era. It didn't start aggressively. It started softly, almost movingly. The aquamarine ring at the evening reception after the 2018 royal wedding, one of Diana's most recognizable pieces, worn as a visible tribute to the woman Harry loved and lost. The world responded warmly. It felt genuine. It felt earned. But then the pattern continued. The butterfly earrings, the Cartier tank watch, the gold bracelets, item after item, moment after moment, each one a piece of Diana's identity carefully selected and worn at high-profile events, guaranteed to generate maximum photographic coverage. Each piece was more than jewelry. Each piece was a message. And the message was consistent. I am connected to her. I carry her. I am continuing what she started. And it wasn't just the jewelry. It went deeper, much deeper. Think about the 2021 Oprah interview. Now strip away your personal feelings about the content of that interview for a moment, and just look at its architecture. The lighting, soft and cinematic. The setting, intimate and carefully staged. The themes, a woman being silenced by an uncaring institution, her mental health ignored, her cries for help dismissed by gray suits, more interested in reputation than humanity. A woman alone in a hostile system, reaching out to the public directly because the institution had closed every door. Does that narrative structure sound familiar? It should, because it is almost a beat-for-beat update of Diana's 1995 Panorama interview. The interview that shook the monarchy to its foundations. The interview that Diana gave in secret, bypassing the palace entirely, speaking directly to a public that she trusted more than the system that imprisoned her. For Charles Spencer, watching the 2021 Oprah interview from Althorp, it wasn't a tribute. It was something else entirely, something that made his blood run cold. And then came the documentaries, the Netflix series with its intimate footage, the confessional camera moments, the careful narrative of a couple pushed out, hunted down, and forced to flee, and threaded through all of it, always, the ghost of Diana. The implication that history was repeating itself, that the princess who was destroyed by the establishment had been succeeded by a duchess who was facing the same fate. It was a branding strategy, an extraordinarily sophisticated one, but a branding strategy nonetheless. And Charles Spencer, who watched his sister's genuine trauma be exploited by media predators in real time, who has spent nearly 30 years protecting her memory from exactly this kind of commercialization, was watching it happen again, not to Diana this time, with Diana, using Diana, packaging Diana's pain as a product. Now ask yourself, how long do you think a man like that was going to stay quiet? Here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in Hollywood saw coming. By early 2026, the Sussex media machine was under serious pressure. The Spotify partnership had collapsed in a blaze of unflattering headlines, with executives reportedly describing their experience as deeply disappointing. The American Riviera Orchard lifestyle brand, Meghan's ambitious pivot into the world of high-end homemaking and luxury goods, was struggling to generate the cultural momentum its creators expected. Harry's polo documentary and Meghan's Netflix cooking show were being described by industry observers as pleasant but forgettable, content that didn't move the needle in the way a global streaming giant needed. They needed something transformational, something that would silence the critics, justify the enormous multi-year Netflix deal, and remind the world why Harry and Meghan still mattered in a cultural landscape that was moving fast and forgetting faster. And then someone had the idea that seemed, on paper, to be absolutely bulletproof. 2027 marks the 30th anniversary of Princess Diana's death. 30 years since the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. 30 years since the world stood still. 30 years of grief, mythology, and unanswered questions. The appetite for a definitive, authorized, emotionally resonant documentary series about the life and death of Diana, Princess of Wales, would be unlike anything the streaming world had ever seen. It would be a global event, not just a show, a moment. Netflix executives understood this immediately. A multi-episode epic, cinematic, emotional, world-stopping. The kind of content that doesn't just win awards, it wins the culture. The kind of content that people talk about for decades. And the angle that made it truly irresistible? Draw a direct, unambiguous line between Diana's struggle against the establishment in the 1990s and Meghan Markle's struggle against the same forces in the 2020s. Position Meghan not merely as a member of the family, but as the modern incarnation of Diana's fight. The new woman in the line of fire. The 21st century continuation of a story that never really ended. It was bold. It was ambitious. It was designed to make Meghan the definitive voice of Diana's legacy going forward. There was just one catastrophic problem with this plan. They needed Charles Spencer to play along. When Netflix approached the Earl of Spencer about cooperation with the 2027 anniversary project, they weren't asking for a small favor. They were asking for everything. They wanted access to Althorp House itself, 5 centuries of Spencer history contained in stone and shadow, the kind of backdrop that money genuinely cannot buy. They wanted access to family archives, the kind of private, personal material that transforms a documentary from a clip show into a revelation. They reportedly wanted access to Diana's personal handwritten diaries, to never-before-seen home footage, to the private woman behind the public icon, the raw, unfiltered Diana that the world has never been allowed to see. And they wanted Charles Spencer's face, his voice, his endorsement, his blessing. Because without it, the series was just another unauthorized retrospective. Interesting, perhaps, but not legitimate, not sacred, not the real thing. With Charles Spencer on board, the documentary would have been untouchable. His participation would have signaled to the world that Diana's own blood family approved of the comparison being drawn between the princess and the duchess. It would have been the ultimate authentication of the Sussex narrative. But when Charles Spencer sat down and reviewed the full proposal, something happened that the Netflix producers and the Sussex team had apparently not prepared for. He read it carefully. He considered the role Meghan was set to play. He absorbed the framing, the comparisons, the spiritual successor narrative. He looked at the architecture of the whole project, and he saw, with absolute clarity, what it actually was. And then he responded in 4 words. Is this a joke? 4 words. No equivocation, no diplomatic softening, no invitation for further discussion or revised proposals. The gates of Althorp closed, and they did not reopen. Think about what that moment must have felt like in those boardrooms. Think about the silence that followed those 4 words. Because this wasn't a rejection from a random relative with a grudge. This was the verdict of the man who has more moral authority over Diana's legacy than any other living person on Earth. Now here is where the story deepens in ways that even the most seasoned royal observers didn't anticipate. Charles Spencer did not make this decision in isolation. Sources close to the palace have been increasingly vocal about a relationship that has been developing quietly for several years. A relationship that the world's attention has largely overlooked because we have been so focused on the rift between the 2 brothers. The relationship between Charles Spencer and Prince William. Think about what these 2 men share. They are bound by the same loss. They are driven by the same protective instinct toward the woman they loved. And they have both been watching, with increasing frustration, as the memory of that woman is commercialized, repackaged, and sold to global audiences by a media operation run, at least in part, by the son and husband that Diana never got to know as adults. William has been fuming about this for years. His feelings about the exploitation of his mother's image for commercial purposes are well documented, even when they are not publicly stated. He is the future king. He cannot be seen to be blocking his brother's media projects. He cannot issue statements from the palace without triggering an international press storm about censorship and family warfare. But Charles Spencer can. The elegance of the position Charles has taken is almost architectural in its precision. When the palace blocks a Diana documentary, it looks like institutional control. It looks like the monarchy managing its own reputation, suppressing inconvenient truths, protecting the establishment. The press writes those stories eagerly. But when Diana's own brother, the man who eulogized her, who protected her sons, who has spent 30 years guarding her memory from exploitation, publicly labels a project as a joke, that's not censorship. That's family honor. And you cannot argue against family honor without looking like the villain of the story. Harry cannot lash out at his uncle without appearing to disrespect his mother's family. He cannot argue with William without reigniting a public feud narrative that audiences are genuinely exhausted by. He is caught in an impossible triangle of loyalty, heritage, and commercial ambition. And Charles Spencer, with the full quiet support of the future King of England behind him, has placed him there with surgical precision. The Althorp veto is not just a rejection, it is a checkmate. Let's pause here because this moment deserves a direct question to you, watching this right now. At what point does honoring someone's memory cross the line into exploiting it? Where exactly is that line? Because this is the central moral question of this entire story, and it's one that doesn't have an easy answer. Harry genuinely loved his mother. Nobody who has watched him speak about Diana in unguarded moments doubts that love for a second. The grief is real. It has shaped every major decision of his adult life. His marriage to Meghan, a woman he believed the establishment was trying to destroy just as it destroyed Diana, is rooted in that grief. His move to America, his rejection of royal life, his willingness to burn every institutional bridge, it all comes back to the loss of his mother. But love and exploitation are not mutually exclusive. A person can genuinely grieve someone and still allow that grief to be packaged and sold. A person can genuinely believe they are honoring a legacy while simultaneously treating it as a commercial asset. The question isn't whether Harry's love for Diana is real. The question is whether that love is being protected or being monetized. And Charles Spencer, watching all of this from Althorp, has apparently arrived at a very clear answer. The financial implications of this veto are staggering in ways that the celebrity press coverage has barely begun to capture. The 2027 Diana documentary was not just another project in the Sussex content pipeline. It was the tent pole, the flagship, the project around which the entire next chapter of their Netflix deal was being constructed. Industry analysts have been describing it, privately and occasionally publicly, as the one guaranteed hit in an otherwise uncertain content portfolio. Without it, the math gets very uncomfortable very quickly. The Sussex lifestyle requires an extraordinary level of consistent income. Montecito real estate at that tier doesn't maintain itself. Security arrangements for a family that has publicly documented the threats against them are enormously expensive. Staff, travel, the infrastructure of a global brand operation, all of it requires a revenue stream that only A-list media partnerships can provide. Netflix was that stream, and Netflix's patience is not infinite. Streaming platforms are brutal ecosystems. They run on data, not sentiment. If a content partner's shows are underperforming and their most anticipated tentpole project has just been publicly torpedoed by the family whose cooperation was essential to its legitimacy, the conversation in those boardrooms changes character very quickly. The question stops being, how do we support this creative vision, and starts being, what is the return on our investment? Brand strategists in both London and Los Angeles are saying the same thing right now. The Spencer veto is a terminal event for Sussex royal-themed content. When the brother of Princess Diana publicly questions whether a project is even serious, you have lost the authentic connection that was your primary selling point. You can't come back from that with a revised pitch deck. And the damage doesn't stop at Netflix. we need to talk about what this means for the Sussex brand in the broader Hollywood ecosystem. Hollywood runs on perception. It runs on the invisible social currency of who is authentic, who is connected, who has the real keys. For several years, Meghan Markle occupied a unique position in that ecosystem. She was a bridge, a woman who had lived in both worlds, the ancient world of British royalty and the contemporary world of American celebrity, and who could translate fluently between them. That bridge was built on a specific assumption, that she had genuine, legitimate access to the royal story. Not the official palace version, the real version, the human version, the version that Diana herself had tried to tell the world before her death. The moment Charles Spencer publicly questions that legitimacy, the bridge starts to shake. The concern among serious Hollywood players isn't just about one documentary, it's about brand contamination. If Meghan is perceived as someone who is exploiting a beloved figure without the blessing of that figure's own family, she becomes a high-risk partner. Not because people don't like her necessarily, but because the optics of aligning with a narrative that Diana's brother has called exploitative are genuinely dangerous in a cultural moment that is increasingly sensitive to questions of authenticity and consent. We've already seen the cooling signals, the slower-than-expected momentum of American Riviera Orchard, the fashion endorsements that haven't materialized at the level that was predicted, the A-list social invitations that seem to be arriving less frequently. None of these are catastrophic individually, but they add up to a picture of a brand that is losing altitude. And the Spencer veto is the event that accelerates that descent. There is a personal dimension to this story that cuts beneath all the business analysis and brand strategy, a dimension that gets to the human heart of what is actually happening here. Charles Spencer has been carrying a specific guilt for almost 30 years, a guilt that very few people discuss, but that anyone who has studied the Spencer family history understands is central to who he is and why he is so ferociously protective of his sister's memory. It was Charles who introduced Diana to the journalist who conducted the 1995 Panorama interview. The interview that is now understood to have been obtained through a deeply unethical process involving forged documents and psychological manipulation. Diana was vulnerable. She was in pain. She wanted the world to hear her truth. And someone took that vulnerability and turned it into television gold at her expense. Charles Spencer watched it happen. And when the full truth of how that interview was obtained emerged years later, the weight of that knowledge landed on him with devastating force. He had, however, inadvertently played a role in one of the most significant exploitations of his sister's vulnerability in her lifetime. He has lived with that knowledge, and he has spent the decades since making sure nothing like it ever happens again. Now think about what he sees when he looks at the Sussex media strategy. He sees a vulnerable narrative, the grief of a prince, the struggles of a biracial woman in a hostile institution, being amplified, sharpened, and packaged for global consumption by a sophisticated media machine. He sees the same architecture, the same emotional manipulation, the same deployment of victimhood as a commercial strategy. And he sees his sister's name being woven through all of it as the ultimate legitimizing force. For Charles Spencer, this isn't abstract. This isn't political. This is deeply, viscerally personal. He has seen this movie before. He knows how it ends, and he refuses to let it end that way again. Let's talk about what this means for Prince Harry specifically, because in all the coverage of this story, Harry has been somewhat lost in the noise, positioned as a passenger in his own narrative, a man whose wife's ambitions have carried him further and further from the family he was born into and the people who loved his mother most. Harry's relationship with the Spencer family has always been one of the genuine emotional foundations of his life. The Spencers represented something that the Windsors, by their very nature, could not provide: warmth, directness, the sense of being seen as a human being rather than a constitutional function. When Diana was alive, She was the bridge between the cold formality of Windsor life and the emotional richness of the Spencer world. After her death, that bridge was maintained by Charles Spencer's commitment to his nephews. He was the one who stood at Westminster Abbey and promised to protect them. He was the one who ensured that they maintained their connection to Diana's family, to Althorp, to the world she came from. For Harry to now find himself on the receiving end of his uncle's public contempt, to be the person whose media ventures have pushed Charles Spencer to the point of issuing a 4-word dismissal, is a rupture that goes far beyond business. It is a rupture with his own history. And the question that Harry must be sitting with right now, in the quiet of Montecito, is this: at what point did honoring my mother become building a brand? At what point did I stop being Diana's son and start being a Netflix executive's asset? And is there any road back from where I am now to the place where my uncle can look at me without contempt? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that this moment demands. There is something else buried in this story that deserves specific attention. Something that explains why Charles Spencer's refusal to grant archive access is even more devastating than the public rejection itself. The secret weapon of the 2027 Netflix project was the archives. We're not talking about the footage that has been seen 1,000 times, the official engagements, the state visits, the charity work. All of that material is already in the public domain and has been used in a dozen retrospectives. What made the 2027 project potentially world-stopping was the promise of the private Diana. Diana's personal handwritten diaries, home movies that have never been digitized, never been broadcast, never been seen by anyone outside the Spencer family. The private woman writing in her own hand about her fears, her hopes, her grief, her fury. The real Diana, not the curated public icon, but the human being behind the tiara. That material exists, and it is held at Althorp. For the production team behind the 2027 project, access to those archives wasn't a nice-to-have. It was the entire commercial proposition. In the modern documentary landscape, audiences are extraordinarily sophisticated. They have seen the official Diana story dozens of times. They know the photos. They know the speeches. They know the panorama interview. The only thing that could have made a 2027 documentary genuinely unmissable was the revelation of material that nobody had ever seen before. And that material belongs to Charles Spencer. By refusing to grant access, he has done something that is almost counterintuitive in its wisdom. He has protected Diana's mystery. In a media landscape where everything is eventually revealed, where privacy is a commodity that gets stripped away by streaming budgets and journalistic determination, Diana's inner life remains private. It remains her own. Charles Spencer has ensured that the real woman, the woman who wrote in diaries and appeared in home movies that the world has never seen, cannot be turned into content. That is an act of profound love. And it is also an act of profound strategic intelligence. Because as long as those archives remain sealed, the question of who Diana really was continues to be answered by the people who knew her, not by the people who are building brands around her. As we move through 2026, the existential question for the Sussex brand has shifted fundamentally. It used to be, how do we grow this into something that justifies our ambitions? Now it is simpler and more brutal. Who are Meghan and Harry without Diana? It is a question that their content record does not answer reassuringly. Archetypes, the Spotify podcast, was described by critics as thoughtful but not essential, the kind of content that gets respected but not urgently consumed. The Netflix cooking show was warm and watchable, but it did not capture the cultural moment its makers needed it to capture. The Polo documentary did solid numbers, but nobody outside the core Sussex audience was talking about it the following week. All of these projects share a common characteristic. They are entirely dependent on the celebrity of the people making them. And that celebrity, stripped of its royal dimension, stripped of its Diana connection, stripped of the narrative of wounded royals fighting against an ancient and hostile institution, is thinner than it needs to be for the scale of operation the Sussexes are running. This is the hidden damage of the Althorp veto. It doesn't just stop one documentary. It reveals what was always underneath the brand. Two people who are enormously famous, genuinely compelling individually, but who built their media identity on a very specific kind of story that they can no longer tell with the authority they once commanded. The audience that follows the Sussexes most passionately is the audience that follows the royal story. Remove the royal story, and you don't just shrink the audience. You remove the emotional stakes that made the content feel important. Diana was the emotional stakes. She was the reason that everything Harry and Meghan did felt connected to something larger than celebrity. The loss of a mother, the repetition of history, the tragedy of a family that destroys its own. Without Diana as the connective tissue, the Sussex story becomes the story of two wealthy and famous people navigating the difficulties of celebrity, which is a story, but it is not a world-stopping one. Let's bring this back to the core of what we're watching. What Charles Spencer has done is not simply block a documentary. He has drawn a line in English soil that goes 500 years deep, and he has said, "This is where exploitation ends, and truth begins." His 4 words, "Is this a joke?" will be remembered, not because they are clever or cutting, though they are both, but because they carry the full weight of a brother's grief and a family's honor behind them. He is not wrong to ask that question. He is not wrong to feel that watching Meghan Markle position herself as the modern Diana in a multi-million-dollar Netflix series is an absurdity. He is not wrong to see the structural comparison between his sister's genuine life-and-death battle with an institution that was trying to bury her, and a media couple's strategic deployment of victimhood narratives as a commercial brand differentiator. These are not the same things, and Charles Spencer has the standing to say so with more authority than anyone else alive. For Prince Harry, the fallout is personal in ways that will take years to fully understand. He has lost, at least for now, the endorsement of the family that was supposed to be his emotional anchor after Diana's death. He has found himself on the wrong side of a line drawn by the man who stood at his mother's funeral and promised to protect him. That is not a business setback. That is a spiritual one. For Meghan, the implications are also deeply personal, even as they play out in commercial terms. She came into the royal family as an outsider. She has spent years trying to build a connection to its most beloved member. She has worn the jewelry, carried the narrative, positioned herself as the continuation of a story she never got to be part of. And now the man who holds the keys to that story has looked at her role in it and used 4 words to reduce it to nothing. So here is the question we leave you with today, the one that matters most as this story continues to develop. Can the Sussex brand survive the loss of Diana? Because that is ultimately what the Althorp veto represents. Not just the loss of one project, the loss of the narrative architecture that has underpinned everything they have built in America. The loss of the story that made them more than just another famous couple. The loss of the ghost that gave their rebellion its moral gravity. Charles Spencer has not just closed a door, he has pulled a thread. And as 2026 unfolds, we are about to find out how much of the Sussex tapestry was held together by that single thread, and how much unravels when it is finally, definitively, gone. The island at Althorp is quiet again. The diaries remain sealed. The home movies stay in their cases. And the woman resting beneath the trees is, finally, protected from the one threat that even death couldn't stop her from facing: the transformation of her truth into someone else's brand. Prince Harry is in shock. He has every reason to be. The foundation on which the Sussex Empire was built has just been declared off-limits by the man who owns it. And the brother who promised to protect Diana at her funeral is still keeping that promise. 30 years on, that promise is the most powerful thing in this entire story. Think about that. Leave us your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the Diana card is now permanently off the table for the Sussexes? Is there any version of this that Harry can recover from? And what does it mean for the future of a brand built on a ghost? Let us know what you think. Share this video with someone who follows the royal story closely. And stay with us as this story continues to unfold. The final chapter has not been written yet, but for the first time, it feels like someone else is holding the pen.